my name is Florian Windberger, and I'm currently doing my memorial service here in Canada at the Florian Family Foundation, which is a Jewish NGO which teaches people about the Holocaust and the dangers of prejudice. And today I'm going to talk a little bit about the concept of moral responsibility and how moral views can be changed through propaganda, prejudice behavior, and racism in general. So let me jump right into where I come from and why I do what I do here. So I'm from Austria, a small country of 8 million people, which only has the area of 1/20th of Canada, and I guess most of you do not have a clue what Austria stands for, or you have never heard anything about Austria, right? Or like, do you like what are famous Austrians you know, or what do you know about Austria? Schwarzenegger, yeah, that's one. Maybe you know Thomas Vanek, who's now playing for the Montreal Canadiens, and Christoph Waltz. You know the actor? No? From Django Unchained, the doctor? Yeah. Now he lives in Germany, sadly, but he's an Austrian, and that's about all the famous Austrians there are. But it's a really nice small country. As you can see, the capital, maybe you heard of Vienna. I'm from the small city of Graz, which you can see in the southeast. And yeah, let's jump into what I do here. So basically in Austria, when you're 17 years old, you have a physical examination, a mandatory one, where after that the government says, okay, you're fit for military service. We have a conscription, we have a mandatory military service, and if you're seen fit physically, then you have to go to the military. So the military, that would mean 6 months working there, 6 months handling weapons, 6 months learning discipline, and basically learning how to be a soldier in the event of a war. If you think that military service is not right for you and you do not want to handle weapons, then you can say that and you have the opportunity to do something else. You can do a civil service in Austria, which would be 9 months, where you drive an ambulance, work in a senior citizens home, and so on. So that is also an option that many young people choose. And if you say you don't want to stay in Austria and you feel like you have some sort of global responsibility and want to do something abroad, there's also the chance to do that. There are 3 different types of services abroad. There's the social service, which is working in an NGO. For example, in Africa we have a lot of those social service organizations where you work with orphans or you build a school or something. Then we have the peace service, where you work in a peace museum, like in China, for example, in the John Rabe Museum in Nanjing, or in Hiroshima in the Peace Museum there. And the third thing would be the Holocaust Memorial Service. So that is what I do here for 6 months. I work in a Holocaust-related institution, and I teach people about the Holocaust and the dangers of prejudice. But you also have other Holocaust museums around the world where you can work, and you give tours there, and so on. So normally those services would be 12 months, which is double the time of the military service, and you don't get paid. So there are only about 80 people who do that per year from all the Austrians who have to go to the military. Only 80 people decide to go abroad, and I myself decided I will actually split my service. So I did 6 months of peace service in China. I worked in Nanjing at the John Rabe House, and now I'm here for 6 months in Montreal at the Florian Family Foundation. So what are the motivations? Why would somebody do this sort of Gedenkdienst, the Holocaust Memorial Service in Canada? First off, I would say there's a kind of global responsibility, as to say, through the history of Austria, I feel a kind of need to teach people abroad about what happened in Austria and about the dangers of prejudice and racism. And in a world nowadays with the internet, where everybody feels like everything is connected and we have like a sort of global responsibility, is it in, like if you think about climate change, or also about the real dangers of prejudice behavior everywhere in the world, where you have a rise of nationalism and so on, that everybody has a sort of responsibility. So that would be the first argument or the first motivation from my side. The second one, of course, would be an intercultural experience. So, of course, if I'm from Europe, it's always a cool experience to go abroad, which is why I chose to go to China. I speak Chinese, at least a little bit, and that was a really cool experience. Here, of course, in Canada, North America is also quite different from Europe, so there's also a really interesting intercultural experience, even more so in Montreal, where you have a lot of different ethnicities, a lot of different people from all over the world. The third thing, kind of learning from the past, as I said before, if you look at Austria's history of the Holocaust and of the Second World War, it is very important that we learn from the mistakes that Austria did and also Germany did, and that we do not let similar things happen nowadays. Which brings me to the fourth thing, preventing genocide through education. That is basically what I do here. I tell you guys a little bit about the Holocaust, the dangers of prejudice, moral responsibility, and so on. So for that, I think there's a really good quote from George Santayana: "The one who does not remember history is bound to live through it again." So that means if we do not remember the problems we had in history and the problems or the dangers and the racism that has happened in the Holocaust, for example, or in the Second World War, also in Asia, then we will do the same mistakes again. So if we do not learn from a very nationalistic behavior or from prejudice and racist behavior, we will do the same mistakes again, as I will talk later on about the rise of nationalism and propaganda in Europe. So for that, I think I will jump in the Holocaust real quick. So you see how propaganda and the Holocaust changed the opinion of the people and how it influenced the moral views of the people through racism and anti-Semitism. So the propaganda during the NS time, during the Nazi time, was based on four main aspects. There was the radio, there was the Volksempfänger, that would mean in English something like the people's receiver, which was a really, really cheap radio where the people could only listen to two broadcasts, which were both from the Nazi Party. So at that time, not everybody had a radio, and radios were generally really expensive, but the Nazi Party made this really, really cheap radio where you could follow propaganda. Basically, the only thing you could listen to was the ideas of the Nazi Party. And if you wanted to change it, because you probably know, if you put an extension or something on a radio, you could listen to other broadcasts. That's sort of how a radio works. But if you did that, you were put in jail. So that was not a wise decision, so you couldn't escape the propaganda in that sort of way. There's also, of course, there were also posters, as I will show you later on. Propaganda posters where you could see caricatures or cartoon versions of Jewish people, or also pro-war posters, the German race against everybody else, and so on. Third thing, newspapers. The German name's Der Völkische Beobachter und der Stürmer. That would mean in English the People's Watcher. So the name itself tells you a little bit what it's about. So it tells you, well, we are watching you, and now we are telling you what we think of you. So basically it's an internal newspaper about the state affairs, currently in the German country and abroad as well. And of course the views in there are the views of the Nazi Party. Der Stürmer, the Stormfront translated, is dedicated to tell the people who the foe is, who is the opponent of the German race. In most of the cases, of course, that were the Jewish people, that was communism, capitalism, and so on. But mostly the anti-Semitism, with saying the Jewish population and the Jewish people are the black sheeps of our society. The fourth thing, cinema. You had a weekly show where you were told what is going on in the world, of course, again, from the Nazi perspective. So in every media aspect of life, you had a singular opinion. You had the opinion of the Nazi Party, and you were influenced through propaganda in every single way, which is very important if you look at media nowadays, for example, in the US, where basically all the media is controlled by Murdoch, or like where you have this same sort of central media power, where media is not divided into a lot of different perspectives, but it's all from one person or one group. So here are some examples. On the left side, that is a poster. It means opponent's agitation or faux agitation, where you see a cartoon version of a Jewish person. So it is cartoonized, and like it doesn't resemble a human being, basically. It goes away from portraying Jewish people as humans. It puts them in a cartoon version, as you also see on the right side. And all the bad things, basically, for the Nazi party were in this one picture, where you can see the dollar sign as a sign of American people and capitalism. You see the sign for communism behind him, and a Jewish person portrayed as the Pied Piper. And sort of like these are, it should tell the people, these are the things we are against, right? Remember, we are against the Jewish people, we are against communism, and we are against capitalism, and we are against America, and so on, and those are our black sheeps, right? On the right side, even more horrible, that would mean what it tells is the Jewish kill plan against the non-Jewish people is now being revealed. The Jews are our misfortune. And it shows a very horrible thing on the right side of the picture. That's Jewish sacrifice. So that's an old myth in Europe that Jewish people are sacrificing young Christians and then drinking their blood. That's what the picture is about. And of course that is not based on any facts. That is a sort of state propaganda fiction thing, right? So you have to remember that nearly everything, everything in the Nazi propaganda was based on the Nazi ideology and fiction around that. Just to change the moral views of the people and to form a prejudice behavior and to make a sort of stereotyping of the Jewish people as the evil in society and the evil for mankind. Also here, a picture, German soldiers standing in front of a Jewish business, saying, Germans, defend yourself against the Jewish people. So what happened in Germany and Austria was soldiers were standing in front of Jewish businesses and were telling the German people, do not go in there and buy from them, they are our misfortune and the Jewish people are bad, right? So that was one of the first things the Nazi party did against the Jewish people. Here, for example, a documentary, sort of Nazi documentary, which should be it was made in a way that the people should think it's a real documentary based on facts, when in fact it was just like a fictionist propaganda documentary. The name is The Eternal Jew, a documentary about the world Judaism, and I have a really little clip. Perhaps if you cannot read the subtitles, I'll explain it later. Normally it has to load a long time on this computer.
Sie sind hinterlistig, feige und grausam und treten meist in großen Scharen auf. Sie stellen unter den Tieren das Element der heimtückischen unterirdischen Zerstörung dar. Nicht anders als die Juden unter den Menschen.
So, I don't know if you could read that. Basically, the movie said, look at the rats in the animal kingdom. The rats are go in packs and they spread diseases. They are the malicious and destructive animals, the subterranean animals. And the rats are exactly like the Jewish people for human people, for the real humans, right? So they say, well, the Jewish people are subhuman, the Jewish people are like rats, and therefore we should destroy them because they only do bad things and evil things. So that is, in my opinion, one of the most horrible examples of how moral views are like how the Nazi system tries to change moral views through propaganda and fictitious things. So that has no basis at all, but it sort of tries to convey the opinion of the people to be against the Jews. Here another picture, quite interesting in that sense. In propaganda, it says, "Come on, people," or "Come on, stand up, and the storm will break loose." So this one, for example, is a war propaganda, where you can see the workers on the left side saluting and being grateful and cheering to the brave soldiers who go to war for the German Empire, right? So that, of course, is also a really mind-changing propaganda if you see it together with the Hitler Youth. Probably you heard of the Hitler Youth, which is I think the worst aspect of the propaganda, because it tries to change the opinion and the free will or free ideas of young people. So the Hitler Youth basically was a sort of Boy Scout thing, where when you were over 7 years old, you were you had to go to the Hitler Youth, and there you would be told how to have obedience and how to follow commands, and basically how to be a little soldier. So from the ages from 7, 10 on, most of the people joined, and then they were made to little soldiers, because of course, you have a question? No, but like if 99% were in the Hitler Youth, then you couldn't be not part of the Hitler Youth, so you didn't have a social choice there. So young people were forced into the Hitler Youth and learned how to be a soldier there. So the Nazi Party, of course, knew there would be a war, so they started that before, so the next generation of warriors would be very obedient and would follow commands really good, because they were told all those things at a really, really young age. And also the anti-Semitic propaganda against homosexuals, Roma and Sinti, and that kind of people as well. But there was also the same thing for girls, right? So for girls, you had the Bund of German Girls, where they were taught how to sew things, how to cook, and how to be a good housewife. They were told it's really good if you have a lot of children for the German Empire, because then there are more real Germans, and that is really good. Of course, with the background, then we have more soldiers to fight for the German race. And they were, you can see how the females were driven into a position that they will stay at home during war times and basically stay in their country and run the country without males. And the males were forced into the soldier perspective, that they will fight for their country and fight for their nation in the event of a war. So that then led to the Holocaust between 33 and 45. A real quick summary of the Holocaust. Holocaust comes from the Greek words holos and kaustos, which means completely burnt, and the Hebrew term for it would be Shoah. The Holocaust basically began in 33, where Hitler gained power and he started the persecution of Jewish people. So Jewish people were expelled from public life, from the economy, and from education. As you saw before, as an example, German soldiers or German people would say, do not buy from Jewish businesses, so they were driving them into bankruptcy. But also in the education sector, for example, there were special schools for Jewish people. Jewish people were not allowed to be in the same, have the same social status as Aryan people or German people. And they had to wear the Star of David to on their right shoulder to tell everybody, oh, I'm a Jew, and everybody knew how to react then, because you had to, they were forced to basically portray themselves as a Jewish person and to tell everybody I'm a Jewish person, and thus the persecution can be easier for the German people. After, also in the following years, there were the Nürnberger Rassengesetze. Those were sort of, as I told before, that Jewish people and Aryan people or German people should not mix. So they were also not allowed to marry. Shouldn't be friends, like you shouldn't be friends with a Jewish person. You're not allowed to kiss a Jewish person. And if you did anything against this law, you would be put in jail. The first outbreak of the anti-Semitism would be the November pogrom in November 38, where in the major cities, or basically all around the German Empire, there was an outbreak of anti-Semitism. People were destroying synagogues, like the German people were killing Jewish people, destroying Jewish businesses, and so on. And that was when the international community woke up, basically, and thought, okay, we have to help the Jewish people in some sort of way, and we should do something against that. That was why they held the Evian Conference in 1938, where all the world leaders came together and tried to decide how to help the Jewish people in the German Empire. Sadly, all of the nations basically said, it's really sad what happens in Germany, but we do not want to take any Jewish people in our country, right? So there was only one country in total, the Dominican Republic, which said we want to take Jewish people and we want to help them through giving them a visa to our country. I think like the Canadian government official at that time, he said something like, we don't want any Jewish people, 0 Jewish people are too many Jewish people in Canada. So people were, like the leaders were saying, okay, we are really sorry what is happening, but we do not want them ourselves. A little quick, because most of the people think Hitler and Nazi things, that's Germany and Austria is sort of the victim, and Austria does not really belong to the Nazi ideology, and they were not aggressor themselves. But in reality, most of the Austrian people were also pro-Nazi. So when Hitler invaded Austria, there were a lot of people who were really happy about that. If you think about history, it's easier to explain why that happened. So if you look at Germany, Hitler came to power in 1933 because after the Great Depression of 1929, people were really poor, and he told everybody, well, I'm going to give you jobs and everything will be better for you. In Austria, the situation was as bad as in Germany, but with another factor, which was that before the First World War, Austria was a huge country. So maybe you know that before the First World War, the Austrian-Hungarian Empire was the biggest country in Europe. And so the people felt, after the First World War, when Austria lost, they felt that they lost all their power. They're now this little country nobody will ever recognize anymore, and they felt that with Hitler and the German Empire, they can be big again, you know? So if they combine their powers, Austria and Germany, that they will be one great nation, like before the First World War. Which is why many people were happy that Hitler came to Austria and got Austria in the German Empire. So here you can see a speech of Hitler in Vienna, where masses are cheering and listening. Or here, for example, even the children making the Hitler salute, and on the banner it says, "We sing for Adolf Hitler." So the children, they were also thinking, or some of them were thinking, well, this is a great new leader. Germany and Austria will be one big country, and it's going, everything is going to be better in Austria, basically, which was not true. And here you can see the ballot. Hitler actually made a ballot in Austria if the Austrian people would want to be part of the German Empire. So it says here, do you agree or do you accept that Austria will be part of the German Empire again? And do you accept Adolf Hitler as your new leader? As you can see, the ballot was not really democratic. You had a big circle for yes, really, really small circle for no, and behind you there were some soldiers, and if you put your sign on no, that was not a wise decision at that time. So there was no real democratic values or anonymity like nowadays, so you basically didn't have a choice. and the ballot went on for 99% in favor of Austria being part of the German Empire. That is very important if you look at now, like referendums nowadays. If you look at Crimea, for example, where you also didn't have a real democratic referendum and ballot. For example, in Crimea, the ballot was transparent. They didn't have envelopes, so everybody could see what you were voting for. And there were also Russian soldiers standing in the referendum or in the ballot area. There were, like, they didn't force you, but it was not meant to be really, really democratic like in Western countries. So the Holocaust went on in 42, the Wannsee Conference, which was a conference of Nazi leaders, where they decided upon the final solution. You probably heard of that. That means the final solution of the matter of the Jews. So they decided it's time to really kill off every last Jew in the German Empire. So they established more and more death camps, which were, like, you probably heard of death camps. There were, in the German Empire, there were labor camps and concentration camps where people were forced to work for, like, to manufacture ammunition for the German soldiers and so on. But after 42, most of them transformed, or there were more and more death camps where people, or Jewish people and homosexuals and so on, they were just sent there to die. So that was the instrumentalization of the murder, the final solution. So real quick, like how it worked in general, it first started with the identification. In the German Empire, who is a Jewish person? Then you isolated them through, like, telling them they have to wear the Star of David, and they were not allowed to be in the same class as German people and so on. Then you had a sort of ghettoization, where Jewish people were forced to live together in a certain area, which was then called a ghetto. And then they were deported to labor camps or death camps. And afterwards, they were killed. Then you had Einsatzgruppen. That is actually also the English term, which means like work unit, something like that in English. But it's really hard to translate in English, so the English term would also be Einsatzgruppen. And there were 4 Einsatzgruppen, which were basically mobile killing units. So they would go around the country and kill Jewish people or homosexuals, Roma and Sinti, or people with physical challenges, like if they maybe had one arm less, then they were also considered as less human and subhuman, as well as the Jewish people, and they were seen not fit for the German Empire and for the evolution of the German race. So this is also one horrible thing that resulted because of the propaganda and the prejudice and stereotypical forces, like the propaganda of the Nazi system to change the moral views of the people. Here, a very striking picture, you see some survivors of Mauthausen in Austria after the war. So you can see like the people who actually survived the Holocaust and survived the death camps and labor camps, they were nearly starved to death. And they probably experienced like the worst thing that you can experience as a human. And I really want to tell you, like, this is what happens if you do not see the dangers of prejudice, and if you let state run a propaganda to the masses and totally change their moral perspective. So here, some facts about the Holocaust. Like, there were more than 7 million people killed during the Holocaust, but like it were not only Jews, it were also political enemies, homosexuals, Roma and Sinti, and also Jehovah's Witnesses. So all the people that the German party or the Nazi party has seen as unfit for the German evolution, because they thought we need to keep to ourselves, we need to be the Aryan race, and thus everybody who is not good for the next years or for the evolution, as they called it, of the German race, they should be killed. And the Jews, of course, were the prime victims because they were seen as the worst part of the human of humans. So one would think that Austrians remembered that, right? So after the war, one would think, well, things changed to a democratic state, and people would remember what happened during the Holocaust, and something like that would never happen again, right? So during the war, there were actually 600,000 Nazi party members in Austria registered, and that is a huge proportion of the Austrian population, of course, because if you have at that time maybe 6 million people, that's like a tenth of the people are Nazi party members. And after the war, Austria even had something like the Wiederbetätigungsgesetz, which is a law against Nazi ideology, so against everything pro-Hitler. So in Austria, if you would, also in Germany, if you would raise your right hand for a Hitler salute, or if you would say anything pro-Hitler, you would be put in jail, right? So the government really tried to exclude the Nazi ideology from the state after the war, yeah?
Why suddenly did the Austrian government want to do that right after the war? Like, why not when it was happening?
Well, while it was happening, Hitler ruled Austria, right? So Austria was part of the German Empire. So only after the war, when Germany lost the war, Austria and Germany, because the Nazi party basically failed and there were the Allied forces in the countries, they convinced, or they forced basically Germany and Austria to make a law like this. In Austria, it was also for the thing that Austria can be perceived as a victim. So after the war, there was a reintegration of former Nazis. So because in Austria there were not a lot of political active people after the war, they had to reintegrate former Nazis into the political system and give them some power, because there was nobody else to lead the country, which was also a really horrible thing, because that formed the next thing, which is called the victim theory. So the former Nazis, of course, they wouldn't say, well, yeah, we did horrible things, and we were real aggressors during the Second World War. Instead, they said, yeah, we were the first victim. And that was also the opinion that the international, like the Allies had, and the international powers. So Austria, after the war, was perceived as the first victim of Germany, the first country that was occupied by Germany and was being reintegrated in the German Empire. Which was, of course, not true. Like, Austria, at the Second World War, they were an aggressor to the same extent as Germany. And they also had Nazi party members, and they also did horrible things, and the people were also in favor of the Nazi ideology. And this victim theory held on until the 90s. So until the 90s, people in Austria, especially the young people, who were not told what really happened, they were thinking Austria was the first victim and Austria didn't have any role in the Holocaust. So it was only until Kurt Waldheim, who was a UN General Secretary before, and when he tried to run for presidency in Austria, that was the first time that Austrians basically remembered their past, because the media found out that he was an intelligence officer under the Nazi party. So a guy who was UN General Secretary and who wanted to become an Austrian president of Austria, which he also became, he was a former Nazi. And then the basically public outbreak in Austria started, where people remembered that Austria had not the role of a victim, but they were in reality aggressors as well. And only after that, in the 90s, they started a kind of restitution and remembrance, and they built Holocaust memorial buildings, they started the work that I do. So they started to give young people the opportunity to go abroad and teach about the Holocaust and educate people instead of going to the military in Austria. So it is a very new thing, or now it's like more than 20 years, but if you look at it, only after 40 years after the war, people in Austria started to change from the victim thesis perspective to an aggressor perspective. But the same thing happened in other parts of the world as well. So because I stayed in China, I want to make a quick change and show you a little bit about the Second World War in Asia and the propaganda of Japan, for example, during the Sino-Japanese War. So this, for example, would be one poster of the Japanese, where you can see the flag of the Nazi flag, the German flag, plus the royal Japanese flag, and Japan people crushing Americans and Chinese people, right? So that was also a kind of war propaganda. The Japanese people also had a same ideology as the Nazi party, so they were also nationalistic, and they viewed the Chinese a lot to the same extent as the German party and the Nazi party saw the Jewish people. So Germans and the Nazi party said the Jewish people are subhuman and they should not have the equal rights to us, and they are not real humans. To the same extent, Japanese people before the war said Chinese people are not as good as Japanese people, and they are sub-Asian culture, right? So the Japanese culture is the only good Asian culture. So that then resulted in the Nanjing massacre. That is the subject what I was working with when I was in China. And so I want to give you a real quick go through the Second World War in Asia to some extent. So Japan invaded China. First of all, the Manchuria made it to basically a puppet state. All this without a real declaration of war. And after that, they went down the east coast through Beijing and then to Shanghai. So before they arrived in Shanghai, the July 7 incident, as it's called, happened, where the Chinese and the Japanese forces clashed for the first time, and that was when the real Chinese-Japanese war started, as historians say. And that was the time where the real Japanese aggression in China started as well. So after that, they occupied Shanghai, and then the next goal for them was Nanjing. Nanjing at that time, for those of you who do not know, was the capital city of China. So as soon as the government officials in Nanjing found out that, of course, the Japanese army will go to Nanjing and they will lead all their people to go there, they fled. So all the government officials fled from the capital city, all the rich Chinese people fled from the city, and there were only the poor Chinese people left, as well as a few foreigners. And those few foreigners then acted upon their sort of moral responsibility, and they formed the Committee for the Nanjing Safety Zone. So they knew that the Japanese people would come into Nanjing, and they knew that Nanjing would be occupied. But they tried to save the Chinese population in Nanjing from the aggressions of the Japanese army. So under John Rabe, a German Nazi party member, who was the chairman of this Committee for the Safety Zone, they constructed a wall within the city and made 25 refugee camps, Red Cross there, to save the civilian population from the Japanese aggressors. Because what happened outside of the Nanjing Safety Zone was that basically everybody who was outside was murdered, all the women were raped, half of the city was burnt down, and it is probably one of the most horrible examples of what humans are capable of. And you could really if you look at it as a historian's perspective, you could really see that the Japanese people, through their propaganda in their homeland and home country, didn't see Chinese people as humans in any aspect. Otherwise, they wouldn't have done such things. For example, there was a contest between generals who would decapitate more people, right, in a certain time frame. So who would decapitate 1,000 people first? I mean, that is just a horrible display of what can happen in a wartime, right? The problem is, nowadays, this massacre, even though it is a really, really horrible thing, is used for propaganda as well. So if there, for every, like, because Japan didn't formally apologize after the war, China now uses this massacre whenever there is a problem within the Chinese-Japanese relations. For example, at the fight about an island, which you probably know, if you, like, which is still present, I just always forget the name of the island. If somebody knows it, you can enlighten me, but I really, like, that is one of the things I always forget. And yeah, so at for example, at the problem with the island, where both countries say, we want this island and this belongs to our country, China uses the massacre as to say, well, yeah, but look what you have done to China, you know? So in every international political problem, they use that as a propaganda. Or for example, if you go to the Nanjing Massacre Memorial Museum, it has a very different use as memorial museums for the Holocaust. So what was very important for me is, if you go to Europe and you go into a Holocaust Memorial Museum, you will probably leave it with sadness about what happened, right? And with grief about how they could do such things. What the idea of the massacre memorial in Nanjing is that you leave with a hatred against the Japanese people. So the massacre is used as a propaganda, as an anti-Japanese propaganda, to sort of try to convince the people that Japanese people are really, really bad persons, even though the massacre happened at the same time as the Holocaust in Germany, and nobody now would say, I do not like Germans because of what they did in the Holocaust and in the Second World War. But in China, many people, many old people, but also some young people, still have a kind of hatred against the Japanese people just because of what happened during the massacre. Just because I forgot to tell you the numbers, so there were 300,000 people killed during this massacre, and the safety zone, which was led by the Nazi John Rabe, actually saved 250,000 Chinese people from this massacre. And like all the foreigners were also told to leave the city, but they just acted upon their moral views that they have to help the Chinese people. And the same thing, like, because that is all in the past, but I also want to show you some modern examples of propaganda. So here, for example, you have the National Party of Austria with some of their posters and slogans. So, for example, on the top right, you would have, love your neighbor, from me, that's our Austrians. Or more courage for our Viennese blood, too much that is foreign helps nobody. So the idea that the party tries to convey and tell the people is that only the Austrians, we only care about Austrians, right? If immigrants come to our country, we don't care about them. For me, for our country, our neighbor, and our friends, those are only the real Austrians. So that's a really nationalistic ideology, which reminds a lot of the propaganda during the Nazi time, and is really frightening, in my opinion. And you have the same things in his rap, for example, like he... Okay, shouldn't start that fast. He and his party tried to talk to the younger people, especially, to convince them and try to change their moral views of who you should love and who is a good citizen as fast as possible. So they hand out comics to little children, because in Austria the voting age is 16. They hand out comics and they make raps to try to bring along their values and what they think is right. So I have a little example of a rap he did, where you can really see what the values of his party are and what it stands for.
Ich lass mir den Mund nicht gern verbieten, auch wenn die Menschen noch so wüten. Die Wahrheit kommt irgendwann ans Licht, dann nutzt es nichts, wenn der Kanzler spricht. Böse Menschenrechte retten, gibt's hier vielleicht was zum Verstecken? Statistiken schön und Berater einkaufen und dann die Leute für blöd verkaufen. Ich sag nur das, was sich alle denken, wir wollen unser Land nicht mehr verschenken an Menschen, die unsere Kultur nicht schätzen, sich über unsere Gesetze wegsetzen. Wer sich nicht integrieren will, für den hab ich ein Reiseziel. Ab in die Heimat, guten Flug, Arbeitslose haben wir hier selbst genug. Einbruch, Raub und Überfall, Verbrechen steigt schnell und überall. Die Ostöffnung ist eine tolle Sache, es grüßt dich herzlich dein AC Strache.
AC Strache kämpft dafür, dass wir Österreicher Herren im eigenen Haus bleiben. Deshalb ist er unsere Wahl.
So you see the ideas that he is trying to portray. Like he is telling all the foreigners and all the immigrants, they are burglars and robbers, and they are always the people that are unemployed. At the same time, in interviews, he tells the people, well, the foreigners steal our jobs. So there is always this kind of nationalistic bias where you say, foreigners steal our jobs, but they're all unemployed, which doesn't make sense. Like most of the stuff he says, where you only have the stereotypical view of immigrants and foreigners and try to change the minds of young people mostly. So he also, like his party is totally against the European Union. He says the Eastern enlargement, which means like that more Eastern countries join the European Union, is a very, very great thing, because in his opinion, that would mean, or it means, that more people from Eastern countries would have the opportunity to come to Austria, because within the European Union you can work anywhere. So he also says he fights for Austrians to remain masters of their own home. So he says like he plays with the fear of mostly uneducated people, where he tells them, watch out, the foreigners will steal our jobs and we won't be the masters of our own country. So this is really going to a very, very far-right nationalistic idea, which is frightening. And in the last national elections, his party got over 20%, which is more frightening. And you have the same rise of nationalism in many European countries, because I would argue, whenever people have a sort of economic breakdown, like it happened, they search for an easy black sheep. So they search for, who can we blame? And the nationalist parties mostly say, yeah, blame the immigrants. The immigrants are responsible for everything, and they sort of form a prejudiced behavior and the stereotyping. So that also happens in other German countries or German-speaking countries. Here are a few examples. On the top, that is the same, like middle top, same party. It says, love your home instead of the thieves of Morocco. At the bottom, Maria instead of Sharia. So rather have a nice German girl instead of girl with a hijab, right? So they say, well, you know, yeah, it's like this nationalist idea that, yeah, this religious girl is bad, we rather have a nice German girl. Or on the left side you have for handing out more visas and letting more people from other countries go into Switzerland, 2 times no. And you see like the hands of darker skinned people who want to have a visa or who want to live in Switzerland, and you shouldn't do that because that is a bad thing. and the most graphical, I would say, on the top right of the German Nationalist Party, which says, social things are only possible nationally. So you can only be a social human being and you can only have a social state nationally. So you don't have to be socially, you don't have to be social with other people, your neighbor countries, or with immigrants. Just for your national people you have to be nice. And the immigrants here, or the people who are not the nationalists, are portrayed as a black sheep who is actually being kicked out of this sort of red-white border. So it's a very graphical thing to show we do not want any immigrants in our country because we only want to do social things for our own people. Yeah, the same examples are also in the US. In America, for example, here you can see a propaganda use from the Westboro Baptist Church. God hates America, God hates fag enablers, and so on. So they would go to funerals of soldiers who were killed in the war and then sort of demonstrate at the funerals and tell the people, yeah, your son died because the US is a bad country and everybody and God hates America because you all are not that homophobic as we are. So that is also a use of propaganda to change the views of people. Thankfully, they are not really successful. But there are also other types of propaganda where you can see how views can be changed. A really good example of modern media would be the Fox News. You probably know the news station in the US. That is a news station that is based on fiction most of the time. So they always, like if you just watch that for 1 hour, you will see at least 10 different stereotypes of immigrants, how everybody in the Far East is a terrorist. They really are a good example of modern propaganda. You could also have seen that before, probably during the war in Iraq. So for those of you who do not know how the war in Iraq started, basically the US government said everybody in Iraq is a terrorist. Most of them are terrorists and they have weapons of mass destruction. So through media and through propaganda they told everybody and spread fear basically that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction